All right, we're going to get started. Good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the second program in Steep Rock Association's 2026 Winter Speaker Series, Preserving Washington's Agricultural Heritage with Patrick Horan. My name is Blair Granum. I'm the manager of SRA's Judea Garden. Just some basic housekeeping notes before we start. To keep things running smoothly, please remain muted during Patrick's presentation. If you have any questions, I kindly ask that you use Zoom's chat feature found at the bottom of the window, and we'll be sure to address those questions at the end. Your feedback is very much appreciated, and we are always looking for interesting topics to present. Therefore, please keep an eye out for a short questionnaire that we will send out tomorrow via email. Our schedule for this year is set, and you can see the upcoming speaker series events on the right side of the screen. A recording of this presentation will be posted on our website. Lastly, before I introduce our speaker, my sincere thanks goes out to all of our supporters who have shaped what Steep Rock is today. We are a nonprofit organization able to provide these programs free to you because of the generosity of our donors. When you see them around town, please say a special thank you to our event sponsors you see on the screen now. If you'd like to support our efforts, please visit our website or contact our office. With that, I'm delighted and excited to introduce tonight's topic and speaker. Patrick Horan, along with his brother Quincy, owns and manages Walding Farm, which is a certified organic vegetable operation in Washington, Connecticut. They specialize in heirloom varieties and they cultivate between 25 and 30 acres of land each year. Walding Farm employs a farmer's market and CSA model, as well as a wholesale model to some supermarkets in the tri-state area. Washington's farming story stretches from early homesteaders growing row crops and tobacco through the dairy boom of the 19th and early 20th centuries to today's resurgence of small and mid-sized organic farms, orchards, and pasture-based operations. Though the scale of farming has come full circle, today's farmers face new challenges, developing markets, running CSA programs, and keeping agriculture alive in a changing landscape. Tonight's talk will trace Washington's agricultural past and explore how the community can ensure a vibrant farming future. And with that, I will now hand it over to Patrick.
Okay, thank you. Just going to bring up the talk here. Hit the share, I did, and then we're going to go to the live presenter view. Okay. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And I'd like to first thank Steep Rock for inviting me to give this talk and also recognize Washington's Historical Society, which much of the research that I've done over the past few years comes from. And it's really always rewarding to dig into our town's agricultural past. And while this is hardly the definitive account of our town's rich farming tradition, I hope it's at least enlightening and jogs some pleasant memories from some listening here tonight. Okay. Here we go. From the earliest days of the town's settlement in the first part of the 18th century, right up to the present day, there's been farming in Washington. And prior to the colonial settlers arriving in the 1720s and 1730s, the indigenous peoples of the Chappaqua River Valley had actually been cultivating fields for crops and worked its land to produce food And they were also skilled at enticing game for their meat protein intake for an estimated 8 to 10,000 years. So that was pretty amazing. Farming life today may not resemble the homesteads of the earliest days of Judea Parish, as Washington was known at the time, nor Washington Depot's heyday as a fluid milk center of Connecticut, where legend has it we were called the Holstein capital and had over 150 dairy farms. But agriculture, happily, is still present and vibrant. For almost 2 centuries, ours was a community of open fields and pasture. And since World War II, much like Connecticut, it has slowly given way to increased housing, old farms recreated as estates, and a re-emerging woodland once stripped clear for pastures and industry. Our story is common amongst our fellow New England towns, but it starts, like a lot of people, back in the days of the colonial times. The early days of Judea Parish basically comes down to about 1725 to 1730, when Joseph Hurlburt, having arrived in what was known as Judea Parish, created a homestead which would have been along where Judea Cemetery Road is today. And he saw the possibilities, great possibilities, for farming and industry along the Chappaqua and Aspetuck rivers. And he was soon followed by families with names that are still familiar in Washington, names such as Calhoun, Averill, Smith, and Cogswell. The latter was the iron ore magnet of the area, and many more people from the greater Woodbury area and from towns from the east and to the south started to see Judea as a place they wanted to settle, including the Averill family. And they still maintain their original homestead purchased in 1746, and it remains an active agricultural property. Their apple and pear orchard attracts thousands to their hilltop each autumn, and they are a vital bridge between Washington's farming past and its present. The slide here depicts what would have been a simple homestead, cleared by hand by the men and women who settled there. These were self-sustaining households, and the earliest agricultural economy within the Housatonic and Chappaqua valleys derived from such industries as sugar production and later pork, which these were firmly established by the middle of the 18th century. And sugar was the largest economic driver, derived from the many maple trees in the area. But pork production, to a certain extent, maize and rye production soon followed. The picture here gives an idea as to the scale of early operations, which were not terribly big, but I'm sure was a lot of work to clear that hillside of trees. Crops which were native to the Wintenauk people would have grown, like maize and a broad variety of squashes, also became staples of the colonial diet. Now, unlike other products grown in the state like oats and barley and flax and hemp, the land in Judea was less forgiving to most farmed vegetation. Tobacco, however, appears to have been an exception and was grown by most homesteads for personal consumption and for sale down to the southern towns and cities like Derby and New Haven. Perishable small fruits had also been grown since the early days of the colony, but were used mostly for the production of cider and brandy at one's home. And, it's interesting to note that water was not considered safe to drink, even with all these beautiful springs we have all over Washington. But it was pork production, which really at first put Judea on the map. And amongst the first agricultural monikers handed to Judea was a section of land known as Pork Hollow or Pig Hollow, which is now what we know as Nettleton Hollow. It was the largest regional pig farming area of its time. In the 19th century, it's believed that Mr. Frederick Gunn, founder of the Frederick Gunn School, disliked the name and suggested that it be named after the Nettletons who farmed there. And so it was. As the 18th century advanced and the state's population increased from 75,000 to 200,000 people, primarily in the coastal cities, there were more mouths to feed. And hogs were then raised in considerable numbers, and Washington's second significant agricultural export after tobacco boomed. The hog raising businesses had the merit of cheapness, plus the hollow had a superior feed to forage from as well. Homesteaders would grow flint for its hard kernel shells to feed the pigs, but more importantly, it had plentiful supply of mast or nuts from the numerous oak and beech trees that littered the hollow, and that produced a superior quality of pork meat. Pork was so important to the state's brand at the time that all pork was labeled as Connecticut pork if produced north of New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And Washington played a huge part of this. This is much like the way Gloucester fish, even though it came from the Long Island Sound in Connecticut, when it went up to Gloucester, it was stamped product of Gloucester, Massachusetts. So that proves like that was something very important to the state back then, that it was branded Connecticut pork. Farmers in Judea who possessed marginal lands, that is, lands which could be used with a degree of difficulty to produce profits from general agriculture, which included hemp and flax and tobacco, soon turned to the beef cattle and dairy business as the population of southern Connecticut continued to grow, hoping to catch some of the pork industry's success. Our area's population had increased steadily, and in 1779, Judea Parish, along with sections known as New Preston, Marbledale, plus a piece of Kent and a piece of Litchfield, which I guess is Woodville, merged to form the town of Washington as we know it today. And with a small number of crop acres per farm, between 1 and 3 acres, clearing was primarily dedicated to clearing timber for pasture. Some of these pastures remain to this day. Now, agriculture was not the main industry yet, as most early settlers also would have worked in the local mines, mills, or quarries along the Chappaqua and Aspetuck rivers. What we know today as Marbledale was in fact a cluster of quarries which dominated early 19th century commerce here. In some parts of Judea, the soil was fertile enough to grow row crops, but factors of elevation, ruggedness, and the abundant presence of stones tended to offset the advantages of soil fertility at that time, and it wasn't terribly profitable to cultivate crops, except for the previously mentioned sugar, tobacco, and pigs. Now, just a quick word on the population. The population of Washington at this point was growing, and in the state census of 1782, Washington had a population of 1,503 people. In 1800, the population rose to 1,568. And it should be noted that at least some were slaves, though it's unclear if these people were counted in the census in 1800. By 1820, there were no slaves accounted for in the town. So iron ore production and quarry production, being the two biggest industries and employers, created a second moniker for the town, Factory Hollow. Now, Washington's farms up to the 1830s were primarily, minus the pork, sugar, and tobacco production, working homesteads, rather than businesses for profit. And excess goods were sold in town or towns nearby if there were such excess. But at the beginning, the homesteading gave way to dairy production in the 19th and early 20th centuries. By the midpoint of the 19th century, Washington's farmers realized the need for milk in cities to the south, like Bridgeport, New Haven, and eventually New York City, due to their rising populations. Well, how could they get more milk to them? Until the 1840s, milk was hauled by buckets, then carted to the Chappaqua River, making its way down to Derby via the Housatonic River and eventually to the coastline. However, it wasn't terribly safe. What we would call raw today, due to bacterial contaminant issues primarily, and that didn't travel well, so most dairy stayed relatively close by. Pasteurization, one must remember, was still a few years away. Transportation costs were high, and only farmers who lived within carting distances of rivers were able to reach the larger towns and seaports, where merchants readily bought up supplies. Early Washington dairy and tobacco producers would have done this. So one cannot speak of dairy farming as a sustainable business model on its own until the second half of the 19th century, with the introduction of the rail lines in 1872 that headed up and down the Chepaug and Housatonic rivers. This was, as they say, a game changer. The introduction of the rail car correlated with the building of the first creameries and processing plants here in Washington. Now, the average size of a dairy herd in the early 1870s was 5 milking cows, which was still quite small, even by 1870 standards, but soon that would change. Traditionally, the colonies and the early United States citizenry were all farmers of some sort. That's simply how it was. Yet by 1870, the federal census indicated that Connecticut farmers were now, for the first time, in the minority. Of all employed persons, only 47.7% were farmers. As farming became more mechanized, and farmers relied more on bank loans for land and equipment purchases rather than on labor, they were then starting to make significant income. Around this time, there also saw an influx of immigrants from Sweden to the town of Washington, which would have quite an impact on local agriculture to the end of the 19th and into the beginning of the 20th centuries. In February of 1873, dairy farmers in the Chepaug River Valley met at the Farmers Hall on Washington Green to form the Litchfield County Milk Producers Association. This picture here is basically where the Washington Club Hall is today. The purpose of the association was to sell and deliver milk to New York City at fair prices for local dairy farmers now that there was rail access. And importantly, in the rail access, they were refrigerated cars. So you could transport long distances and the milk would stay cold. Samuel J. Nettleton accepted the position as the first agent for the association in New York City, i.e., he was their salesman. Later in the same year, the Chepaug River Valley Milk Producers Corporation, SMPC, was created, and Nathan Hart of Cornwall was appointed sales agent for that. Now, the Harts farmed in Cornwall for many years, and just like Washington, that's a name that townsfolk in Cornwall would remember well. With its distribution channels and sales agents in the lucrative New York City market assured, Washington's creamery business developed rapidly. In June of 1874, the creamery in Washington Depot was fully operational. And remarkably, it employed close to 100 workers and produced upwards of 12,000 quarts daily, which were then shipped in refrigerated rail cars out of Washington Depot towards the city. That 100 employees was 15% of the workforce in the town. That's a pretty significant amount. Now, in May of 1883, the SMPC sold the creamery in Washington Depot to Andrew Knauer of Washington, who promptly turned around and sold it to the Ice House, the creamery, and other buildings to the Echo Farm Creamery, which was based in Litchfield, Connecticut. By the mid-1880s, Washington boasted multiple creameries that ran 6 days a week and featured the recent innovation of bottled milk. Now, it wasn't surprising that a few years later, in 1889, milk producers along the Chepaug, Litchfield, and Northern Railroad met at the Washington Town Hall and organized Local Section 103 of the Union of Milk Producers for the supply of New York City markets. Heading into the 1890s, the dairy businesses around town were thriving with more than enough room for others to try their hand at running their own brands. In 1896, Elnathan Mitchell, who had inherited the Mitchell family farm along Wickham Road, was seeking outlets for the family's milk other than Echo Creamery in Washington, and shipped a case of the family milk to his older brother in Bridgeport, Connecticut. He had a nephew named Edwin Buckingham, who went conscientiously door to door for days selling bottles of the Mitchell Dairy Farm milk. And through diligence and diversification into butter and cream sales, Mitchell Dairy became a massive brand in Connecticut and in the region. It is believed that the Mitchell Dairy herd was also the first tuberculin-tested herd in Connecticut, which was a real public health concern at the time. People felt safe with their brand. Besides their own dairy, the Mitchells also purchased from Powell Seeley, Clarence Nettleton, William Hurlbert, Samuel B. Smith, Samuel Hollister, and John Hollister, and Earl Booth, to name just a few of Washington's noted farm families of the day. Fluid milk became a significant economic driver of the town, and dairy farming suddenly became an entree to the middle class. Now, this is a sales ticket from an M.A. Smith, no relation to my family Smiths. But if you look at the price of milk per quart, it was 5 cents. And cream was 30 cents per quart. That would be $1.70 in today's money, adjusted for inflation, and the cream would be worth about 10.50 adjusted for inflation. So, to put it in further perspective, in 1899, dairy generated $7 million of sales in the state, and dairy production accounted for 35% of the gross income of all Connecticut farms. This was a significant portion. And adjusted for inflation, that 7 million today is 250 million. So this real sales. Now, fluid milk was first in agricultural sales in the state, and that would remain so for at least 2 more generations. By 1905, the average income for a dairy farmer in Washington was between $675 a year and $690,000 per year, or between $13 and $13.50 a week. And these were farms with the larger herds of, say, 10 cows. And $450 a year, or about $8 to $8.50 a week, for what were called gentlemen farms. Hired hands would have received between $4.50 to $6 a week to work at the farm, and most had at least one farm laborer. And even the families which had, a lot of children would have had a skilled number 2 to assist with the head of the farm. Now, it's also interesting to note here that almost no farmland was devoted to vegetable crops in the area. It was just enough for each home's daily use and to be put up for the winter. And it would remain so for some time. However, local fruit orchards started to pop up around 1890 to about 1910, and their production increased significantly. The Cogswells, for example, added thousands of trees after the state started counting orchard numbers in the 1890s, and they were in production well into the 1950s. Any excess supply of field vegetable crops, by the way, went to the livestock. Now, tobacco obviously was still a major part of U.S. culture, and it was obviously still a huge part of the economy of Washington's agricultural products. It was still present and quite profitable for those who grew it, and it earned about $300 an acre, which was a lot, but it didn't necessarily grow everywhere. But this picture here, Hedgelawn Farm, which people will know on the right side of 199 when you're going towards Roxbury, and I believe that land goes straight down into Steep Rock land. That hillside produced, I looked for the numbers in the state in the Litchfield farm office, but I couldn't verify it. But it it was apparently one of the most profitable tobacco fields in the entire state, which would be interesting to find out what the real numbers were. I mean, it's a hill to me, but that's a beautiful looking tobacco field from the picture. Now, the new century begins. There's a lot of action in New York City for the dairy businesses of Litchfield and Fairfield counties, and the Mitchell Dairy, which had created its own brand, they were doing house door-to-door sales, etc. But in 1902, in June of 1902, Elnathan Mitchell learned that his butter had received the highest score, the Connecticut Dairy Exhibit, at the Pan American Exposition in 1901 that had happened in Buffalo, New York. So times were good. It was a matter of pride that this town, this little town of Washington, that's when the moniker, the Holstein fluid milk capital, started to settle in. When people said, I'm from Washington, Connecticut. Oh, you're from Washington. It was pretty significant if you were a dairyman to say that that's where you were from. Now, times were good until they weren't. On August 30 of 1907, a gentleman named W.B. Hickox, who was from Washington, was appointed the receiver of the Echo Farm Company. And it was reported by the Brooklyn Eagle newspaper that Echo Farms Dairy of Litchfield, Connecticut, was given up a few weeks ago, quote, end quote. And that Mr. Hickox would be closing the business due to prolonged drought that had created shortages of supply both in New York State and throughout New England. New York City was now the primary sales point for Echo Farms Washington milk supply. So this really, really hurt. And many farms struggled for the first time in a generation to produce and or sell milk enough to survive. But the Mitchells and others persevered. At this time, there were in excess of 140 operating dairies in the town of Washington, and many had become reliant upon Echo Farms. I guess that's an early warning as to putting all your eggs in one basket. But a savior arrives. In August of 1910, the Borden's Condensed Milk Company purchased the interests of the late Echo Farms Company, which included the land, a dam, ice pond, and a 30-foot high brick chimney used to heat in the pasteurization process. And area farmers were, to say the least, deeply relieved. Many tuning in on this Zoom will remember the Borden Dairy, a company founded in 1857 that became a huge U.S. dairy brand and industrial conglomerate. It was known nationwide for its mascot, Elsie the cow, that became an American icon, and it lasted for almost a century and a half before eventually shutting its doors in the early 1990s. And after 20 years, the company's dairy brand reemerged in 2009 in Texas, of all places. But I don't believe it's available here in the Northeast. But Borden's history prior to Washington Depot is interesting in that their first plant for their condensed milk was in an old Burrville mill, which is where basically northern Torrington is. And that was in 1857. And condensed canned milk was brand new innovation, and nobody wanted it. Absolutely nobody purchased it. And it was in danger of going out of business until the Civil War, when the northern troops were supplied canned milk to drink, and it totally saved and revolutionized the milking industry, and Borden's grew. And after the Civil War, Borden's also pioneered the use of glass milk bottling in 1885 and fluid milk, as we call it in today. The sales of it just took off. By the century's turn, Borden's had facilities in 18 towns in New York, New Jersey, Illinois, and as far away as Ontario, Canada. And they added Litchfield County to the list in 1910. So, in the spring of 1910, the Borden's Country Bottled Milk Station number 71 was built in Washington Depot on what was the old Echo Farms building site. In February 1911, 11 dairy farmers, fearing a lack of bargaining power, and they had 211 cows, voted to form a local branch of the Dairymen's League. Milk price stability was a real concern for them, as it remains today. And at this point, the majority of farms in town were still milking around 5 to 6 cows, still essentially gentleman farms. But some had increased herd sizes significantly, looking to get into the middle class. The Dairymen's League in 1911 lists Washington's dairy cattle numbers as 849, with an average herd of 7 cows. Several are now up between 20 to 30. The latter represent the farms as businesses versus the gentleman farms, where economic outcome was not the primary concern. Interestingly, the last 3 farms in town had over 2,000 cows collectively, but we'll go into that more later. World War I in Washington saw many farmers and sons enlisting to serve in the war effort. And lo and behold, women from Vassar College were brought to Washington by the Washington Garden Club and took over some, if not all, the responsibilities of farming in town. These women were called the farmerettes. And this picture here would be, if you were looking at the end of East Street towards Hollycroft, would be on your right, and East Street would be up to the top left. And the barn in the dead center of the picture in the back is still standing today. Now, many farms, experienced a decline after the war because, those who weren't killed in the war effort, when they returned, the men didn't want to farm, it seemed. And there were many transfers of land and herds, which occurred between 1919 and 1924. It said by 1920, Washington now had officially 118 dairymen, as they were called, and they owned 1,566 dairy cows, which was now an increase of now accounted for 13 to 14 cows per farmer. And this would require roughly 3,000 acres of tillable fields for silage production, not including hay fields and pasture. As the 1920s began, there were fewer farmers than before the war, some due to death and others having come home and wished for new experiences. And so they sold their herd and rented their land to their friends. Nonetheless, the 1920s were a pretty stable time for the town's dairy industry. The crash. After the stock market crash in 1929, the Borden Company sold its Washington Depot plant and the land surrounding it to the trustees of the Bryan Memorial Trust Fund, set up by Gregory Seeley Bryan of Washington, who had made a fortune in manufacturing. And even despite the crash taking about half of his wealth, still had enough to endow a scholarship at Harvard and purchase the building, which he gave to the town. The building would serve the townspeople of Washington, both in social and governmental roles. It was not the end of the Borden Company. Their plants in Canaan and elsewhere remained open, along with 2 collection stations in the valley of Lime Rock and Cornwall Bridge. And this is where Washington farmers would have sent their milk. During the 1930s, as more farms closed in town, the price of milk plummeted due to the Depression. It affected everyone. Now, these 2 slides are actually where my family resides today. This is called the Samuel B. Smith Homestead. I had mentioned Samuel B. Smith earlier, and he was a 19th century Smith who farmed significantly and sold to the Mitchells. And the Connecticut State Historic Preservation Office deemed Waldingfield a historic site agriculturally and rechristened it the Samuel B. Smith Homestead, which brought some amusement to our family. But it's my mother, Damaris Smith Horan, is really the last Smith who will live along that street. And we had long sold milk to the Mitchells, and during the 20s had expanded to close to 30 milking cows. We know this number by the amount of stalls which are in the lower part of our old main barn. And my great-grandfather, Mr. C.B. Smith, employed one Everett Mitchell, who was one of the Mitchell men, as the head farmer. And throughout the 20s, it thrived, but sadly, it too became an example of a dairy operation that closed in the 30s as the Depression set in. And you can see by this picture, which is some back of our property here, how open and vast the land was. There were no trees. And some listening to the speech here will recognize the little chicken coop in the center. And more importantly, I want to draw attention to behind the chicken coop, there's a row, a kind of a line of pine trees. Those pine trees were planted probably within a couple of years of this picture in the mid-30s. And those trees, 70 years later, built the current farm barn of which we run our business. Just thought that was a pretty fun thing I recognized. And we didn't disband farming from the property. The land was leased out to other farms for the next 50 years, notably to the Bronson family and then later the Nye family, who ran Davies Hollow Farm down off Sabaday. Between the wars, dairy farming in town whittled down from 118 to roughly 50 farms. And as the New Deal took hold and the economy improved, the farms that remained were profitable. Names familiar to Old Washington like Dodge, later the Potters, Whitehead, Mitchell, Helene, Whittlesey, later Seymour, Wright, Swanson, Marsh, Bronson, Van Sinderen, Wheaton, Woodruff, and Quist, among others, all remained active dairymen. And it's important to remember that by the early 1930s, refrigerated tanker truck systems had been created, and the larger farms in town started to store their own milk for pickup. This meant more time farming, less time trucking, and more money for the farmer. It's a nice old picture of Howie Bronson Sr. on an early farmall. Note the fact that the back tires have no rubber, which is kind of extraordinary. So around this time, it's led to a period where Washington experienced the peak of its actual milk production. Farms grew their herd sizes, modernized their machinery, and took advantages of new science in the production of fluid milk. Milk was also highly regionalized, unlike today, where it comes from all over the country. So it usually stayed within the state and the tri-state area, really. So some of the farmers earlier, like the Mitchells, had figured out ways to stand out in a crowded field, pun intended, and they started to bottle their own milk and brand their own milk and turned into a pretty thriving retail business. And it had great success. The March Farm, which was located along Wickham and at the corner of Wickham and East Street, and the Mitchells, who were further down Wickham, and the Smiths, not our family Smiths, who were also further down on Wickham, were good examples. And this was, some people may have some of these old milk bottles in their attic or in their barn somewhere. But post-World War II really kind of changed things, and jobs in manufacturing and opportunities in education previously unattainable to most U.S. Young men saw a next generation of farmers shrink in Litchfield County and elsewhere. The county became more and more desirable as a place to have a country home, primarily New York City families and Boston families, then go back and farm. And so there was kind of this reverse, and there was exodus of young men and young farmers out of the county. And land, more importantly, fluid milk price instability became the primary issues that caused a lot of these young men to make this decision. They just didn't want to deal with it. And the opportunities post-war afforded them through the GI Bill, going back to school, changing. They were, understandably lured away. And it seems like the issues of price inconsistency and instability of farming in general, this is never really left. It takes a certain type to get into that. So it doesn't mean that we didn't get new farmers after the war. We did. In fact, some of them became prominent names that we know. The Potters, the Bronsons, and the Ferences, for example, all came and set up their milking businesses after World War II. So according to some records that I found in the Historical Society, Sam Averill was interviewed, and he said his dad milked between 20 and 30 cows daily in the 40s through the mid-60s when their decision to go to a full orchard was made. And it seems like that was a wise decision. And the farms that for the better part of a century and defined the landscape of Washington were starting to slip away if they weren't looking to make a significant change. And the Averills happily did, and we have their wonderful orchard to this day. Here we have Bell Hill Farm, which is would have been around the corner from E Street, long gone. And these are pretty intricate barn systems with upper levels for hay and lower levels for the cows. And this was what people saw here for a long, long time. And then they didn't. In the 1950s and 1960s, farming costs had gone up considerably as scale became more important to the post-war US economy. We needed more milk, which meant more cows and more land for cultivation. To produce enough silage, which is green fodder stored in the silos, right? It was like corn and alfalfa. You needed to have a successful raising of milking cows, a farmer needed between basically 1.5 acres to 2 acres per cow. So if you had, 1,000 cows, you needed at minimum 1,500 acres of tillable soil to grow on. So Washington was not only becoming a difficult place to afford to live even by then, it was difficult to find that much land, right? And it became very hard to get, even to rent. And the cost of renting a farm field started to go up considerably. Now, in 1960, the average price paid to farmers for their milk was $4.60, cut weight of 100. You guys all know what the old milk urn, what it looks like. Well, they weighed 100 pounds, and milk to this day is still weighed as if you're presenting it in those things in weights of 100. Now, the cost of production was roughly $3.95 to say $4. So you could make a living doing that. You were in profit. It was still sustainable as a business model, though size became a real issue, in space, more importantly, became an issue in Washington to grow your business. And over the next 20 to 30 years, remaining farms continued to close or really age out, as farms which had been working for generations didn't have a new generation willing to take on the daily life of the farmer. Notably, farmers like George Stribe of Will Clark's Chicken Farm closed in 1984, and Gary Ribillard closed his farm in New Preston Hill in 1988. Edwin Whitehead stopped milking in 1994, though he had dairy replacement stock heifers until 2005. He milked 500 cows at one point. That was not an insignificant amount of cows. Now, farming in Washington was vastly different, and it was becoming even more so as the 21st century approached. When my brothers and I started farming in 1990, there were only a handful of these working dairies remaining. There was one produce and flour farm, which was Painter Ridge Farm, which had been established by Henry Ference in 1979 after having been a dairy previously. The Averils and the Fooths Starberry Farm up on Baldwin Hill and Kilwasser Roads provided fruit to the county and the town residents. And there were a handful of what we would call small hobby farms or gardens. What older dairy farms remained intact mainly raised hay or raised small amounts of replacement heifers, having ceased milking operations in the years prior. It's a nice shot of the Spring Hill Farm's old truck. Today, Spring Hill Farm is a winery where the Whittleseys and Seymour Farm once was, and it continues to work the historic land that brings a new story and agricultural life into the Hidden Valley. The Potters and John Nye and Michael Chernisky were all still in the milking game as we closed out the 1990s, and they were innovating as much as possible to remain viable. Production costs for fuel, grains, machinery, and also finding outfits in the area that could service them were rising above commodity prices that fluctuated greatly during the 1990s and early 2000s. And that meant that other revenue sources needed to be found. By 1995, the Potters, for example, were milking over 200 cows and had 450 head overall from the original 25 Guernsey cows that arrived with Art Potter in 1948. They worked over 600 acres in Washington and Roxbury, 100 of which they owned. They then created an innovative and successful business selling Holstein cow embryos to Europe and Japan. In 1995, the year they started that part of their business, the cut weight price average in New England was $13.70 for every 100 pounds of milk you produced. At the same time, the average adjusted cost of producing milk by these same New England farms increased to $15.37 per hundredweight. This meant that for every 100 pounds of milk you produced, you had $1.67 of loss. Now, John Nye, along with the Pilers and Michael Chernisky, were featured in an article in the New York Times on April 16th, 1995. And forgive me, I had a slide and then seemingly lost it, but the article was titled "Dairy Farms Drying Up in the Town of Washington." Now, with 800 cows, almost the total of the entire town's dairy production a century earlier, John Nye perfectly encapsulated the plight of the dairymen at the close of the 20th century. He leased grazing land from 35 landlords, including Waldingfield, in 9 towns, and he worked an astounding 247 fields. Just thinking of the logistics is exhausting. And he finally left for Utah with 600 of his 800 cows. He sold 200, where the cost of production was far less and more efficient farming models could be realized. He thrives there to this day. Michael Chernisky closed his operation in late 1997, and the last dairy, Potter Farm, closed for good in 2006, though Tim and his son took the herd back to Western New York from which it came, and now farm on a much larger scale. So where does Washington stand today agriculturally? Well, there are at last count 6 to 8 working farms of varying sizes and models covering vegetables, fruit, flowers, and small-scale husbandry. There's, of course, Averill Farm, with its apple and pear orchards, holding strong, 280 years young. Starberry, which the Fooths own, is just behind Averill's and produces their wonderful fruit, like their famous peaches. The Solly brothers, owners of Hollicroft Farm on Judea, pay numerous acres of their farmland, which is connected to Steep Rock and preserved by the association and elsewhere. It had remained a working dairy until the mid-60s, when Steve and his brother Nick took over. In 74, it was turned into a hay business. Steve remains active in the agricultural scene in the county with various alternative agricultural projects. There's Helmstead Farm on Lower Churchill Road, which was once the old Millington property, and they grow certified organic vegetables. And Chippewa Valley raises beef cattle. And as alluded to earlier, we also have Spring Hill in their winery. But farms have been innovative. Things like CSAs, which are community-supported agricultural investment programs, and we grow for families. And a lot of farms do that around here as an economic model, which really helps secure and share some of the risk of growing produce, which, a century ago simply wasn't what they did here. But now this is what can work in this town, in other towns like us. And, just like the dairymen of a century ago, our biggest market happens to be in Brooklyn, New York. So that's kind of a funny turn of events. And, we participate in the local farmers market at the Judy Black Park, which really has become, well, depending on which side of the fence you lay on, it's a boon to the town where farmers and local artisans can bring their food and their vegetables to sell to people on Saturday mornings. And the economic trickle down has helped propel Saturday morning business at the Hickory Stick and at the Washington Food Market and other places in town. So that's been really good. And hopefully we'll see more small scale farms like ours and Helmstead Farm start to crop up. Now, one thing that Waldingfield did, and we didn't do it with Steep Rock, but we preserved 78 acres of our main growing fields with the Connecticut Farmland Trust, who I know Steep Rock works with on numerous projects, including the Hillside Farm down in Nelson Hollow. And, our property is going to be farmed in perpetuity now, which I think is really important for when you talk about the culture of a town. If you break agriculture up into two words, it tells you a lot about the culture if there's no farm there anymore. And I think that one of the things that's so marvelous about Washington and all the land we've preserved is that we can actually get some of these fields back into production. And it just may take a little creativity and a little time. Now, we also do things with Steep Rock, and I wanted to highlight here, we grow in these new, what they call high tunnels all year round. And last year, a year and a half ago, we were part of a grant called the Climate Smart Action Grant. And we got part of it, we became a part of it because of the executive director of Steep Rock. Brian Hagenbuch came to us and asked if there was anything in the language of this new Climate Smart Action Grant that the state was proposing that we could take advantage of. And these high tunnels, they're called season extension growing tunnels, fit. And we wrote up a proposal, and Brian and the Steep Rock team presented it to the Northwest Connecticut Land Conservancy as part of their overall grant. They bundled it in, and we were awarded it. So, Steep Rock had an immense, and will have an immense, be an immense part of Waldingfield's production over the next, 10, 20 years while these tunnels produce food in the middle of the winter. This is spinach, which is pretty amazing. Look at the snow on the sides. And we can't thank Steep Rock enough for that kind of forward thinking. And we look forward to working together in the future with Steep Rock, or assisting and helping them figure out other cool things we can do agriculturally around Washington. Now, recently, the influx of residents in our town, post-COVID, during COVID, it was really a boon to all of us who work in the farming space. And the state of Connecticut, the Department of Agriculture, encourages farms to participate in what they call agritourism. Waldingfield does. We did for about a decade these big dinners up in our main growing field called Outstanding in the Field. And it brought so many people who'd never seen any of our back properties, never seen any of our fields, the ability to come and be a part and reconnect. And that's a really important process and will become even more so going forward, that people want an authentic farm experience. And if you can do it, it's a win-win for everybody. Now, innovations that changed the game, whether it was railroad, whether it was the pasteurization process, the milk bottling process, the sales of Holstein cow embryos, CSAs, they point to one thing, that the farmers of Washington have always tried to be innovative, right? And we know that it's tricky, that in the era of mass production and cheap food pricing, it's a challenge. But Washington has shown that to be a community that wants to support its producers. And I am bullish, for lack of a better term, that we can get new farmers back into Washington, to get farms, get fields which currently are in hay production back into some sort of row crop or fruit production or small scale husbandry of animals. And Steep Rock and the vast acres of farmland that they've helped preserve have played such a vital role in keeping Washington's farms from fading into history. I thank you all for listening. It's not the easiest thing to do on a Zoom. I'm not looking at anybody, but I hope you enjoyed what I researched. And if there's any questions, I hope I can answer them. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Patrick, for an incredible peek at the history of farming in Washington. It was very well researched. It was rich with visuals and the whole sense of community that I think remains today because of the intergenerational nature of farming. And you mentioned that through all the various names that you had, including the Horans. If anybody has questions, please pop them into the chat. And we got a few minutes for questions here. While I wait for those questions to come up, I'm just going to kind of, you kind of planted the seed at the end of the future of farming in Washington. And I mean, you took us through sugar, tobacco, pigs, livestock, the haying, more recently the specialty crops, the winery. Where does Washington go here? How do we keep this a viable agricultural community, given the local and global demands today on life?
Well,
put your crystal ball on
yeah,
there,
no,
Patrick.
Look, there's no panacea that will solve the difficulties and challenges of agriculture. There's, my brothers and I grew up in Manhattan and came to Washington on the weekends and didn't really know agriculture from anything. But today, two of us run a vegetable farm, and our older brother, who started the farm, runs a dairy brand, and works with farms throughout the Northeast. I think ultimately curiosity and diligence and rolling up the sleeves, that's how you succeed in any business, but particularly in agriculture. But we know that one of the primary challenge facing our town is housing, affordable housing. And that's the same difficulty for agriculture. It's affordable land. I'm sure some people were reading about the PA 490 debacle, which had happened earlier this month, and which is about how agricultural land and land use, how it's taxed. That turned into a rather partisan and unfortunately misunderstood. It happens every 5 years. It started in the 60s, where you assess the value of arable land, swamp land, et cetera. And the big fear was that farmers were going to get priced out. And that is hard to tell people, that you want to farm in Litchfield County, but an open field that goes for 100 grand an acre. You know,
Yeah.
the view we're looking at right here, which is now in conservation easement, this is, I don't blame farms for selling, considering how much money is being thrown at them. But it also, the barrier of entry is so significant for young farmers. The Connecticut Young Farmers Association, Connecticut NOFA, the Farm Bureau, there are many agencies trying to figure out how to acquire land for farms. And actually, this is something which you and I have spoken about. Like, can Steep Rock do something along the lines of what Kent Land Preserve has done with their farm along Route 7? Can we get a working farm again and be part of Steep Rock? Now, we have Judea Garden, which is magnificent, and people may call it a garden, but it really is a farm. It's just a small farm, right? And I think there's an opportunity to use the available land which Steep Rock has control of, and get it back into production. But it's just going to take creativity and inventiveness. So
we did have a question. In the early 1900s, were most of the sales regional, like Connecticut, New York, or did they expand out further? Was it New England wide? When did Connecticut agriculture really start to expand beyond kind of our state and region?
Right. So in the dairy world, it's curious because everybody knows of product of Gloucester fish, Massachusetts fish, and Connecticut, or they know of Vermont maple syrup. These brands which have become significant cultural identities of a state. Connecticut never really had that. We had it in the 18th century with the pig, with the pork. And I thought it was really interesting that anything north of New Jersey was branded Connecticut pork. But to a certain extent, we have it in tobacco still, with the Connecticut wrap tobacco, which is sold for cigar production throughout Central America and South America. But the milk that went down to New York, I mean, to say that Litchfield County, these guys were all going to the cities. So it would have not gone further south of New York. It would have gone to Bridgeport, New Haven, and New York City ultimately. And actually, milk is still quite regional. Agrimark, which is the commodity market of the fluid milk industry, it has a different price depending on where your region is, right? The farmers here in the Northeast are not competing with farms in Idaho for pricing. They have a different price model out there. But, curiously enough, fluid milk is the only commodity which doesn't exist on the COMEX. There's no futures in fluid milk. Cows are milking every day. It's not like somebody says, oh, it's going to be a great month of May for the fluid milk. And it's like, no, it's right now, it's February, they're still producing. So, what happens is, it really, unfortunately, is the price point is set by the federal government. And that's where the subsidies come in. It arbitrarily sets a price of production, and the subsidy is supposed to pay back the farmer the difference between the real cost of production and what it's being purchased for. And that, as we know, doesn't happen very often. Maybe what they call the debt payback year occurs once every 7 to 10 years, where milk prices go sky high. Farmers are making money, they're paying off their tractors and then buying new ones and going back into debt, and then price goes back down. But a century ago, all of our milk was being drunk within a 90-mile radius. So really local, what you would call local.
Yeah. You got a big fan club here. I'm just going to run down some comments that we received, from hand claps to "that was fascinating. Thank you. Thank you. It was terrific. Awesome presentation. Thank you, Patrick and Steep Rock. My dad was a dairy farmer in Nichols, Connecticut until the early 60s. So I found the dairy aspect of this especially interesting. And this was fabulous. Thank you. I saw something that the governor announced today, that he's going to make grants or some funds available for Connecticut farmers to try to address food insecurity in the state. And that's the whole focus of Judea Garden, where we produce almost 4,000 pounds of organic vegetables. We distribute them to food banks, residents in need here. And I'm wondering if this is another niche, that opportunity for a niche that our smaller Connecticut farms can produce and provide to schools, can provide to food banks, social service agencies, and other groups to try to reduce food insecurity, where I think in Litchfield County, it's about 1 in every 8 people. So perhaps this is even a new niche where you can come in, because people eat vegetables, they don't eat hay.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And Waldingfield and other farming friends of ours have long donated to local food banks. We've worked with Real Food CT, and we've worked with Kent Farm Bank, Connecticut Farm Bank. Now, we have this excess produce, we get it to them, and at the end of the year, we always got a nice little tax write-off for things. Unfortunately, that was eliminated last year by the USDA. So donating food, which is something we still do, we don't get any credit for that. But food insecurity is something which it's indefensible in a country as wealthy and as highly productive as ours. And it comes down to caring, I guess. We have, I think it's 1 in 6 people are insecure. 1 in 5 children are insecure. That's 20% of the population. And we're the type of farming that my brothers and I do sometimes is, unfortunately, and I think erroneously labeled as, only for the rich can afford it. Now, farmers who are growing food are often asked to sell it at the lowest price possible. And somehow along the way, we've decided culturally that we want cheap inputs, not just for our soil, but for ourselves. And if you are willing to spend 25 to 35% of your disposable income on food, like our neighbors to the north in Canada and our European friends do, that's a significant tell. But the average American spends between 13 and 14% of their disposable income on food. And if you took away the coastlines, it'd be about 7%, which just means that we've been trained to not look at the value of the food, what it does for your body as a preventative medicine, as preventative environmental and ecological, all these things come into play. But we're getting there. I mean, look, when we started, organic farming was considered something that hippies did, and health food stores purchase. Now, if you go to Big Y or Stop and Shop, they have huge amounts of organic produce for sale. So we're going in the right direction. It's just perhaps at a glacial pace.
Yeah. All right. I didn't see any other questions come up, so I want to Patrick, thank you so much for not just the informative history of Washington, but really for the Q&A and the perspective that you have now. And I'm just honored that Steep Rock has such a great relationship with Waldingfield Farms. And I want to thank everybody who participated, attended tonight's presentation. Our next one is March 19th. It's going to be on that elusive bobcat, which I think I have a den on my property, so they are close to my heart. But thank you, everybody, and we're going to call it a night. And thank you, Patrick.
Thanks very much for having me. Appreciate it.
Yep.
All right.